In 2016, a helicopter hovers over the Upper Salmon River in New Brunswick. In the containers on board, dozens of Atlantic salmon raised at a marine conservation farm in Dark Harbor. The biologists loading them that morning knew what was at stake. Atlantic salmon in the inner bay of Fundy had been quietly disappearing from these rivers for decades, run by run, generation by generation. The entire population had collapsed to just a few dozen individuals. These fish weren't simply a reintroduction. They were a test of whether something almost completely destroyed could be rebuilt from nearly nothing. And then, suddenly,
push a major restoration project over the finish line after some unexpected challenges.
To date, 13,230 salmon have been released back into these rivers. Over 700 have returned, the highest numbers seen in decades. And what happened to the river itself didn't fit any of the original models. Tim Robinson is not an indigenous person. He came to Fort Folly First Nation in 1995 as a habitat restoration specialist and never left. 20 years of grants, fieldwork, negotiations, more grants. In May 2015, he stood on the bank of the Paulet River with something new: a rotary smolt wheel, a metal drum about 1 meter in diameter that turns with the current. The fish enter on their own. In the first weeks, the wheel caught only a handful. Technicians drove out every morning, removed the fish by hand, and transferred them to transport tanks filled with chilled water. Each smolt, 7 to 10 centimeters long, nearly transparent, with dark oval spots along its sides, was logged, tagged, and sent to a marine farm at Dark Harbor on Grand Manan Island. The goal was to raise them to adulthood and return them to spawn in a wild river. Robinson told CBC plainly at the time, there used to be upwards of 40,000 adult salmon returning. Today, there are fewer than 200. The species is on the verge of extinction. The transport itself was an experiment. Smolts were carried alive in tanks of chilled salt water across the Bay of Fundy to Grand Manan. Fundy is one of the most turbulent seas on the Atlantic, with the highest tides in the world, up to 17 meters between low and high water. No instructions existed for doing this with wild fish. The team wrote them as they went, but these smolts had already spent 2 to 3 years in the river. They knew the smell of the petit Kodiak. That was what set this approach apart from every previous hatchery program in the region and what almost no one noticed at the time. But to understand why it mattered, you have to go back 47 years. Before 1968, the petit Kodiak produced roughly 20% of all inner bay of Fundy Atlantic salmon. Fishing records documented up to 5,000 adult fish per year in that one river alone. For the Mi'kmaq people, whose word for salmon plamu appears in texts earlier than most recorded place names, the fish was not simply food. The river's very name, petit Kodiak, comes from the Mi'kmaq word Petagotiag, meaning the river that bends like a bow. They had fished here for thousands of years, but the salmon had an enemy. Not a predator, not a poacher, a concrete structure 1.4 kilometers long, built across the river by the provincial government in 2 years. It was not built for power generation or flood protection. The causeway shortened the driving route between two towns. The convenience of a commute cost the river 40 years. In 1968, the causeway turned 21 kilometers of living estuary into a shallow freshwater reservoir. Fish could no longer migrate upstream to spawn. Smolts drifting downriver entered stagnant water and died. In 1989, salmon fishing was banned entirely in all inner bay of Fundy rivers. The logic was straightforward. Remove the pressure and the population would recover on its own. 10 years passed, then 20. The fish kept disappearing. The ban remains in effect today. Children who grew up near Moncton after 1968 never saw a spawning run. Grandchildren of fishermen who remembered thousands of fish grew up with an empty river and considered it normal. By the early 2000s, fewer than 200 fish across the entire inner bay of Fundy, across 33 rivers, had become a scientific fact. Not a shocking fact, just a number in a report. In 2003, COSAWIC officially listed the inner bay of Fundy subpopulation under the Species at Risk Act as endangered, a species facing imminent extinction. For the Amlamgog community, this meant more than a registry status. Chief Joseph Knockwood had been pushing for the causeway's removal since the 1990s, when most government institutions considered it unrealistic. He lobbied, built partnerships, and prepared young community members for work that had not yet begun. The gates opened in 2010. Replacing the causeway with a bridge cost $61.6 million. Construction was completed in 2021, 53 years after the causeway was built. Knockwood did not live to see the 2024 release. The idea was blocked before it became a project, more than once and from several directions at once. Conservationists from the Conservation Council of New Brunswick looked at the project's partner, Cook Aquaculture, and saw a company that in 2011 had paid a $500,000 fine for the illegal use of cypermethrin, which killed lobsters in the bay. It was the largest fine in the history of Canadian fisheries. The same company had recorded escapes from its net pens, through which genetically compromised farmed fish entered wild salmon populations. Their logic was simple. You cannot entrust the rescue of a species to one of the parties responsible for its decline. Scientists looked at the statistics and saw the same story playing out around the world. Hatchery programs on the Atlantic coast produced minimal results. Fish raised in captivity returned from the sea at far lower rates than wild individuals. They competed with wild fish for food, and they diluted local genetic adaptations. It was precisely on this data that Fisheries and Oceans Canada had built its cautious position since the 1990s, and that position had grounds. There was a third problem, a physical one. Even if the farm worked, the river was still blocked. The causeway stood until 2010, and the gates only opened then. Tim Robinson said it plainly to CBC News as early as 2016. He said opening the gates alone would not restore the population. It remained critically small, and without additional steps, the numbers would not grow. But all three objections rested on the same assumption that Fundy salmon recovery was just another hatchery, a replacement for natural spawning with artificially raised fish. It was not. The smolts the Fort Folly team was collecting had already spent 2 to 3 years in a wild river. They had hidden under rocks, hunted insects, and learned the smell of the petit Kodiak. They were not being raised on the farm. They were being sheltered there, sheltered from the most dangerous stage of the journey, the passage into the open ocean, where between 90 and 97% of young salmon die. The farm was not a substitute for nature. It was a bridge across the darkest stretch of the road. But that was only the beginning. The enemy remained. It had simply taken on new shapes. In August 2023, a seal broke through netting at a Cook aquaculture farm in the Bay of Fundy. More than 60 farmed salmon were recorded at the fishway on the Magaguadavic River, the same location where the Atlantic Salmon Federation has been running monitoring since 1992. A farmed salmon in a wild river is not simply an extra fish. It interbreeds with wild individuals, and their hybrids survive at lower rates. Matt Abbott of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick said it briefly at the time. This keeps happening, and each time without consequences for the company. The project was rebuilding a population in one part of the bay. In another part, the same company was continuing to erode it. Both things were happening at once, in the same water. In October 2021, the data arrived. Kurt Samways, a researcher at the University of New Brunswick who had been monitoring the park rivers, looked at the numbers and published what he saw. That season, more than 100 adult salmon had returned to rivers in Fundy National Park, the highest count since 1989. At the same time, more than 4,000 wild smolts had migrated from the rivers into the sea, a 20-year record. Samways looked at those two numbers together and said simply, "The population is not just surviving, it is reproducing on its own." That was already more than anyone had expected, but Samways kept looking at the data. The real surprise came not from where anyone had been watching. Samways paused on one detail. Adult salmon returning to a river to spawn either die there or linger, and their bodies deliver marine nutrients into the freshwater system. Nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter. Juveniles growing in that water find a richer food supply. Samways told journalists that they are deposited into the river, and those nutrients are then taken up. They provide additional food for the next generation of salmon. They make the ecosystem healthier, more productive. There was one more number Samways highlighted separately: a growing proportion of fish returning to spawn more than once, a second time, a third. Most hatchery programs count only the first return and treat the cycle as complete. Here, fish were coming back again. That meant they had not just survived in wild water, they had adapted to it thoroughly enough to complete the full cycle multiple times. Samways began collecting water samples from tributaries that were nearly impossible to reach physically. Not fish, not tracks on the bank, just water. In the laboratory, samples were tested for genetic traces, what salmon leave behind simply by being present: scales, mucus, fragments of DNA. In several tributaries, the analysis returned positive results. Fish were there. According to all previous surveys, they had been absent for decades. No one knew when they had returned. And how many were there? That too, no one knew. The skeptics at the Conservation Council did not withdraw their objections after these findings were published. Their position on the risks of open net pens remained unchanged, and not without reason. But while the arguments continued, the river was already doing something of its own. Each autumn, Tim Robinson and the Fort Folly team walked the banks of the Pollitt and the Petit Kodiak carrying buckets. Adult salmon, each roughly 60 to 80 centimeters long, heavy, ready to spawn, were unloaded from refrigerated tanks into rubber bags and carried to the water. Each fish was lowered in gently, held against the current until it began moving its fins on its own. What happened next, no one had planned. Not the project's supporters, not the skeptics who were still watching the data. Every adult fish that dies after spawning leaves in the river what it carried in from the sea. Organic compounds accumulated over months of feeding on Atlantic herring and mackerel. In the upper Salmon River system, where salmon had gone extinct, this marine subsidy had been absent for decades. When the fish began returning in numbers, the river's productivity rose. According to Samways' data, more nutrients meant more plankton, more invertebrates, more food for young salmon. But something else proved even more unexpected. In 2021 and 2022, researchers began recording kingfishers and mink in the rivers, animals that had not been seen there in years. When the fish returned, the creatures that feed on them returned too. Samways put the observation plainly: we are starting to see other ecological benefits for animals that used or fed on salmon. A trophic cascade, the restoration of a food chain that begins with a single returned fish. None of this had appeared in any of the project's planned indicators. In 1998, Fort Folly participated in the first recovery team meeting alongside Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the first attempt to coordinate efforts across the Inner Bay. In 2001, Fort Folly formed a full partnership with Parks Canada on rivers in Fundy National Park. 14 years of fieldwork, grants, and failed attempts. The approach was refined enough to carry over to the Petit Kodiak. In September 2015, Fort Folly officially launched a restoration program on the Petit Kodiak watershed, the same river where Petit Kodiak salmon once produced 20% of the entire regional population, and where in 2003, a survey found almost no wild fish at all. In October 2024, Fort Folly released a record number of more than 1,300 mature salmon into the Pollitt River. A water blessing ceremony and the release itself were led by Elder Donna Augustine and knowledge keeper Nicole Porter. The release was dedicated to the memory of the late Chief Joseph Knockwood, known as Joe, the man who began demanding the causeway's removal in the 1990s and who was the first First Nation leader to give the restoration project an organizational form. That same year, Fundy Salmon Recovery received the status of UN World Restoration Flagship Initiative, recognition from the United Nations under the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It became one of the most effective projects in the world. Alongside the fish, the project was rebuilding people. Young members of the Amlamgog community were trained as river technicians, learning to install smolt wheels, tag fish, and read monitoring data. Laura Buck, one of the first technicians, told CBC in 2015 that it was culturally important, and that if they did not have healthy rivers, they knew what would happen to the species. The program provided employment and transferred knowledge at the same time. Meanwhile, beyond New Brunswick, Tim Robinson says in interviews that the approach is being replicated on other rivers. He names the Tantramar and the Memramcook, not as plans, but as possibilities, if funding materializes. He says one river will not restore the population, but the more rivers, the better the chance. In early 2026, the Atlantic Canada Fish Farmers Association published a summary that put the total number of mature salmon released across the project's entire history at 13,230. 700 tagged fish have returned. 3,047 are growing now at the Dark Harbor Farm on Grand Manan. In October 2024, on the banks of the Paulet River, Elder Donna Augustine and knowledge keeper Nicole Porter stood at the water's edge. More than 1,300 mature salmon, a record for the project, were unloaded from tanks into rubber bags and carried to the river one by one. The release was dedicated to the memory of Chief Joseph Knockwood, who began pushing for the causeway's removal in the 1990s and did not live to see this day. Robinson later said that Fort Folly is a small First Nation and could not have managed this scale on its own. He said they were deeply grateful for all the partnerships. Next spring, a few dozen smolts will leave that stretch of river for the sea. Most will die in the bay. Those are the statistics, and they do not change. But some will return in 3 or 4 years, from the ocean back to the Paulet. 13,230 adult fish returned to the rivers. More than 1 million eggs and juveniles were released into the Pettit-Kodiak watershed. 700 tagged individuals have come back. 3,047 are growing right now at Dark Harbor.